Today, we're diving deep into a controversy that's shaking up the F1 paddock. Buckle up, because McLaren boss Zak Brown is rocking the paddock with explosive statements. Just imagine, team principal meetings that look more like a reality show episode than serious discussions about the sport's future. That's exactly what Brown is calling out. But is he right? Or is this just another chapter in F1's always turbulent politics? First, let's set the context. Formula One has always been a sport where backroom decisions are as important as what happens on the track. Teams have considerable power in decision-making, participating in crucial votes on rules and regulations. But according to Brown, this system is completely broken. The McLaren boss gave a jaw-dropping example. Remember when Lando Norris was on the verge of a suspension for accumulating points on his super license? Well, McLaren tried to argue that most of these points weren't for dangerous infractions. But here's the interesting part. Otmar Szafnauer, who was Alpine's boss at the time, was totally against any rule changes. Fast forward a year, and guess what? Alpine's driver, Pierre Gasly, found himself in the same situation. And what did Szafnauer do? He presented exactly the same argument that McLaren had used before. Brown was outraged. Dude, you voted against that. He didn't even remember how he had voted. This example perfectly illustrates the problem Brown is pointing out. Teams change their position according to their immediate interests, without thinking about the greater good of the sport. It's as if each team was playing chess, but with different rules. If teams are really voting only in their own interest, what happens to the integrity of the sport? How can we expect consistency in the rules if they change according to the political winds of the paddock? Brown argues that this situation creates an unstable and unfair environment. He said, "That's not healthy, because it shows that one year it might work for you, the next year it might not work for you." Imagine the impact of this on drivers and smaller teams who could be hurt by decisions made behind the scenes. But Brown isn't just pointing out problems. He has a radical solution in mind. Brown wants to take away the team's voting power and leave decisions in the hands of the regulatory bodies. This would be a drastic change in F1 governance. Brown argues that this would make the sport fairer and more equitable in the long run. He acknowledges that this could sometimes go against McLaren's interests, but believes it's best for the sport as a whole. But would all teams agree with this? It's hard to imagine that teams like Red Bull or Mercedes, who currently have considerable influence, would easily give up this power. And that's not all. Brown also expressed concerns about the rule changes for 2026, but at the same time, he recognizes the need for evolution in the sport. Brown said, "Formula One has always been about developing technology. These rules have been in place for the usual terms, so I think we have to stay true to what Formula One is. It's a delicate balance between maintaining the essence of the sport and allowing innovations that can improve it." Now, let's think about some concrete examples of how this current system can affect races. Remember the controversial penalty for Max Verstappen in Austria after the incident with Lando Norris? Brown questioned, if you take the incident in Austria, the 10-second penalty, that could have been nothing more than tire marks on each other's side pods. He argues that the penalty was applied more for the result of the incident than for the action itself. This raises questions about how rules are interpreted and applied. Brown went further, saying, "It does make me wonder, how did we go racing without any of this stuff for as long as we did, and not have any of these controversies? It's a valid question. In our quest for justice and clarity, have we created a system so complex that it creates more problems than it solves?" The McLaren boss proposes an interesting solution to this dilemma. He suggests changing the voting system, making a proposal pass with 50% of the votes instead of the current majority. This change could make the decision-making process more agile and, theoretically, fairer. But it could also lead to situations where half of the teams feel ignored or disadvantaged. It's a delicate balance. And what does this mean for the future of F1? If Brown's ideas are implemented, we could see a radical change in how the sport is governed. This could lead to more stable and consistent rules, but it could also diminish the team's voice in crucial decisions. On the other hand, if we maintain the current system, we run the risk of continuing with this politics of interests that Brown criticizes so harshly. Could this undermine the credibility of the sport in the long run? It's important to remember that F1 is not just a sport, but also a billion-dollar business. Any change in governance rules would have enormous implications, not just sporting, but also financial and political. Brown also touched on a crucial point when talking about the changes for 2026. He said, "There is a risk there, but then the problem becomes, if you delay them, it will just get closer and closer." At some point, you have to stay true to F1. This highlights F1's eternal dilemma: how to keep the sport exciting and technologically advanced while ensuring fair and balanced competition. The 2026 changes promise to be revolutionary, but they also bring uncertainties. Brown argues that without these periodic changes, F1 runs the risk of becoming a spec category, like IndyCar. This leads us to an important reflection on F1's identity. What sets this sport apart from others? Is it cutting-edge technology, the competition between constructors? Or is it something else, perhaps the politics and drama that we criticize so much, but that also make F1 so fascinating? When thinking about the future, we have to consider how these changes proposed by Brown would affect not only the teams and drivers, but also us, the fans. And we can't forget about potential new entrants like Andretti. How would these changes affect the entry of new teams? Would a fairer and more transparent system encourage more investors to enter F1? Brown touched on this point when he said, "I believe McLaren want to race in a fair and sporting and equitable way, which means sometimes it might go for you, sometimes it might go against you." Could this "what's good for the sport is good for everyone" mentality really transform F1? It's clear that Zak Brown's statements open a Pandora's box of questions about F1's future. He's proposing a revolution in the sport's governance, arguing for more transparency, fairness, and long-term vision. But the question remains, would the other teams, especially the more powerful ones, agree to these changes? And even if they did agree, would this really solve the problems Brown points out, or would it just create new challenges? Now it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think of Zak Brown's proposals? Do you agree that teams have too much power in F1 decisions? Or do you think the current system, despite its problems, is the best we have? Would an F1 with less politics behind the scenes be more exciting, or less? And how do you think the 2026 changes will affect the sport? Leave your comments below. I'm super curious to know what you, F1 fans, think about all this. Are we on the brink of a revolution in F1, or is this just another chapter in the sport's eternal politics? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any F1 videos. See you next time, F1 gang. Let's see how this story unfolds. Who knows, maybe next season we'll be watching a totally different F1, only time will tell.